GP federations are one of the features of primary care over the last few years, and we have helped many practices and groups of practices to set up federations. One of the most important things you need to do when setting up a federation is to decide the purpose of the federation. We've seen far too many examples of groups of practices which have come together to set up a federation because, to be honest, they've been told to do so. And in our experience, that's not a recipe for long-term success. So really understand what is the purpose of the federation. It sounds obvious, but actually it's surprising how often that isn't done. When setting up a federation, the most important things to get right are, firstly, to understand why you're setting it up. This might sound obvious, but far too often we find that clients come to us asking to set up a federation because they've been told to do so, perhaps by their local CCG. So understand why you're doing it, what is the purpose and what benefits are you going to achieve through it. Is it for cost savings, or more likely is it for securing new sources of income? And make sure you understand what those sources of income are and that you've had those conversations with the commissioners. Secondly, make sure that you're entering into a federation with a group of like-minded practices. If you're entering into a business with people who you can't work with, it's going to be very, very hard. And thirdly, make sure you understand how it's going to be funded. Are you going to put a call out to the practices, to the member practices, on a capitation basis? Is the CCG offering you funding? Do you need bank funding? At what stage is it going to become profitable? Because clearly you're going to have to make money out of it, otherwise there's no point starting. Once you've decided to set up a federation, that you've agreed on the purpose of the federation, who is going to be a member of it, the next thing is to think through some of the more practical aspects of how to go about setting it up. One of the first questions we're asked is about what business vehicle to use. And to be honest, you can use pretty much any business vehicle, but we find that it makes most sense generally to use a company limited by shares. Once you decide on that, the next question is to decide, is this going to be a for-profit business vehicle, a for-profit company, or a social enterprise? Often the social enterprise will be a community interest company. We find this can be quite a contentious question, because if you put a group of GPs in the room, you'll often find half of them will say this is all about profit, and the other half will say this is all about social enterprise. And so coming to that agreement as to what kind of vehicle it is can be quite difficult. We help explain how you can find a balance between social enterprise and for-profit without limiting yourself in the future. So basically ensuring there's a degree of flexibility, because often one of the challenges with federations is that the future is unknown. Although you can have a clear objective, it's often difficult to say exactly what this is going to be in the future. One of the questions which practices often get hung up on is the voting rights and the appointment of the directors. If you're a small federation, often you'll find that there is one director appointed for each practice. That works fine up to about 5 or 6 member practices. But once you get bigger than that, it starts to become very difficult to manage. And one of the key things in a federation is the management element of it. In the larger federations, it makes much more sense to have a management board of appointed directors, sometimes even professional directors, paid directors to run the company. Then you have a big difference between the directors and the shareholders, which practices sometimes struggle to understand. The shareholders, you'd have one practice, one share, or one shareholding. On the shareholding side, each practice will have its own shares and will vote as a shareholder. In the larger federations, they wouldn't have their own director. Now, the way that works is obviously very different to a partnership where you get one partner, one vote. In a large federation, the shareholders appoint the directors, and the directors have day-to-day management of the organisation. The role of the shareholders is then simply to hire and fire the directors, if you like, and to give them their mandate for what they can and can't do. It's not a day-to-day management role like it would be in a partnership or in a smaller federation. Most GP federations don't actually provide the services themselves. Those services are provided through the underlying member GP practices. How those are subcontracted is very important, because if a member practice is providing a particular service because they have the resource to do so, one of the other member practices may not want to pick up the liabilities associated with those services. So that comes down to the way the subcontract arrangement works and who is responsible for any problems arising and indeed who receives the income for having delivered those services. Some of the particular problems when structuring a federation that you need to think about include the pensions, the CQC and the professional indemnity insurance. These are quite complicated regulatory questions, and it's important to get the structure right and to understand who is delivering the services and which entity those services are delivered from in order to make sure that you're properly compliant. The last thing you want to do is, for example, deliver services out of a business vehicle which isn't CQC registered. That would obviously be a criminal offence. And likewise, the pension question is complicated. The way that the income flows through the federation will determine whether or not it is pensionable, and indeed whether or not you want it pensionable will be determined by individual circumstances. It needs some thought up front as to what income do you want to be pensionable and how are you going to make sure that it is. The key to success when setting up your federation is to have clear business objectives, to understand why you're doing it, to have the right team in place and to plan for success. Ultimately, setting up a GP federation is about setting up a new business. To achieve success, like in any business, you need to be very clear about what the objectives of that business are, of the federation are. Secondly, you need to have good leadership and management of that organisation. Being too collective about the management is often the recipe for problems. And thirdly, you need to have very good planning in place to understand how you're going to deliver your objectives. So my recommendation to set up a successful GP federation is firstly to understand the objectives of that federation. Where will you be in 5 years' time? What services will you be providing? Secondly, to plan appropriately to achieve those objectives. And lastly, and most importantly, to have the right team in place, the right leadership, the right management, and the right professional advisors around you.